Welcome to Conversation Ex Nihilo. This is Billy. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope this podcast finds you well. As some of you know, I've been reading a lot about the Founding Fathers lately, and I just kind of finished with James Monroe. So I'm out of father country, and I'm moving into the younger people who, took the torch from the Founding Fathers and moved it into another direction. The Founding Sons, maybe they could be called. But, I talked to the author, Suzanne Munson, to this degree. Suzanne's a very interesting woman. She is a lecturer about the Founding Fathers, mostly about Thomas Jefferson. She has written a book called Jefferson's Godfather, The Man Behind the Man, which was a biography of George Wythe, who was Jefferson's early mentor. In the podcast, I asked her if he was Scottish. That may seem to have no significance. It does, though, believe it or not, because a lot of our Founding Fathers were mentored by Scottish men for some reason. And I think the reason was because the Scots actually, had quite a tradition for standing up to British rule. I think that the Scots actually had quite a lot to do with influencing the Founding Fathers' thinking, very specifically Jefferson and Madison. But her most recent book is the Metaphysical Thomas Jefferson, which is an exploration of Jefferson's current views and what they might be about American government, higher education, foreign policy, military, media, etc. You might wonder how one would know what Jefferson thinks about the political climate today. Well, Suzanne and the medium, Jana Ana, have channeled Thomas Jefferson and spoke to his spirit about today's times. And before you sneer, before you laugh, listen to the interview and, read the book. I enjoyed the book. I do like how she approaches it from the very beginning. For those of you who are skeptical, think of it as fiction. And if you do so, you will still get something out of it. If you are a believer in the paranormal, you might really get something out of it. How do I feel? Well, I'm glad you asked. I don't know. To be honest with you, I am not really a paranormal believer. I don't usually adhere to those sorts of stories. I love those stories, though. Oh, I'm a sucker for good ghost stories. I'm a sucker for a good horror film. The thing is, though, I'm just too much of a skeptic, maybe deep in my bones. However, I have a great-great-grandfather who supposedly was a medium and a spiritualist who predicted his own daughter's death. Who also predicted many other people's future. I think he made a living doing so in New Jersey until he was caught poisoning some of the locals. So some have said that he was a con man who just loved poisoning people with oysters. Others have called him a gifted medium. I don't think it is passed on through the family, though. I don't know what to make of it. I'm an agnostic about a lot of things. I'm open to possibilities. I love the idea of miracles. I can be a cynical SOB too, and I can really sneer at people's nutty ideas. I am very fond of this expression. I think I mentioned it on the previous podcast. Ridicule is the only weapon against unintelligible ideas. That came from Thomas Jefferson. And I love that quote. But I also have this problem that I think many other people love it too, whether they realize it comes from him or not. And today we just have ridicule, ridicule, ridicule. Every idea seems unintelligible to the person who can speak the loudest. That's in my nature too. I'm an American. I am an American, just like TJ. And I definitely want to shout people down sometimes. But I also am just getting tired and just so weary of this. I'm much more interested in listening to what other people have to say and trying to be a little bit more open, if not to the objective reality, be open to their subjective experiences, points of view, opinions, especially insofar as it doesn't harm anybody, but also insofar as it might help some people. This book, if you love the paranormal, it might turn you on to history. It might make you want to read more about Thomas Jefferson. If you are a social critic about today's media landscape, you're going to get something out of it, right? Whether you believed it was through the ghost of Thomas Jefferson or if it was all Suzanne Munson in the medium, Jana Ana, doesn't really matter, does it? The thing is that you're going to have a conversation with some like-minded people through literature. Enjoy it. The link to her website is in the show notes. I encourage you to check out the book. Um, yeah. Thanks for joining. Enjoy my conversation with Suzanne Munson.
Let's go, watch it roll. We've got a lot of bottles and it's number gross. Hey, yo, here we go. We've got a party's why we look so dope. We disturb the peace everywhere we go. We can get a kiss from almost every girl.
Well, I grew up in a family loving history, and our ancestors go way back in American history to actually the first colony in America, Jamestown. I had some relatives there. And then on the Western Front, I had other relatives who came a century later who were on who were pioneers there. So my parents loved history, and I've always had a great love of history as well.
Was there a specific type, well, I guess, era of our history that you followed more than others?
I'm particularly interested in colonial history.
Yeah.
That's where the great ideas for this country began with the founding fathers. And I wrote another book about a founding father, George Wythe, who was the mentor to Thomas Jefferson and gave him some of his best ideas. And so I was familiar with Jefferson's story, particularly with the first part of his life.
Right.
And so this other book that I have written, the most recent one, is in a way, it's a continuation of that first story.
Mm. Tell me a little bit about Wythe and his relationship to Jefferson. Was he Scottish? Was he part of that
Yes,
group?
the Wythe is an English name, but he did have Scottish ancestors and Quakers. And I think that legacy really shaped his viewpoint. His he had Quaker values when some of his peers lacked some of those virtues, I think, back in the day. And so he kind of caught Jefferson at just the right moment in Jefferson's life. Jefferson had lost his father when he was 14 and had, in his own words, had no good adult role models. He was on his own, basically. So he went away to college at the end of his 16th year, more than 100 miles away from home, no supervision or very little. And in his own words, he said later that he was hanging out with the wrong kinds of men, racetrack bookies and card sharps and so on. Of course, he was he was always a good student, but he was looking for fun as well as a teenage boy. And then he said that he met, luckily, some men of very high standing, and he wanted to be very much like them. George Wythe was one of those men.
It's absolutely imperative to reach people when they're young, isn't it?
Yes, certainly is.
Do you ever think what would have happened had he not met Wythe?
Well, he was always, very bright. Of course, Jefferson was a genius, but he could have turned out as a gentleman farmer, chasing foxes, uh, he said in his own words, because most of his friends who were at the College of William and Mary at the time, of course, this was a long time before the Revolution, had no idea of becoming statesmen as the founding fathers became later at the Revolution. And so most of them returned to their plantations and they became gentlemen farmers. So there were not that many professions for young men. The law was one, and Jefferson eventually um, went into the law, and he asked George Wythe if he could be his legal apprentice. And he studied with George Wythe for 5 of his most formative years, really, really important years. And Wythe was a statesman as well as a very eminent attorney. So Jefferson saw him going into the legislature, having a leading influence there. And so I think Wythe modeled statesmanship for Jefferson. And also Wythe was an abolitionist. And Jefferson had very strong anti-slavery views as a young man, and even tried to propose laws to end slavery gradually. And of course, these were shouted down by the establishment, much to his chagrin. And later on in life, he was in financial difficulty and was not able to free his slaves for various reasons. But he did have very strong anti-slavery beliefs, which
I
I
always thought
think
that
he
was,
obtained from Wythe. Yeah.
yeah, and it's always, I think, one of the saddest parts of his story is how it ended for him, isn't it?
Yes. Um, when he died, virtually everything had to be sold at Monticello, and his family was almost destitute. Um,
Right,
and that was due to a lot of factors, market conditions for his crops,
right,
bad loans to friends. He inherited some debts from his wife's father. He didn't really need to pay those debts, but he thought as a gentleman he should do
mm,
that. And there were a lot of factors that were involved in that. Plus, he was away from his farm for many, many years in service to the public. And in those days, they were not paid very well. And you
right,
didn't come
right.
home rich after being in political life in those
I,
days.
I've been thinking about that a lot lately as I've been reading about the founding fathers. Just the sacrifices that they made were
Yes,
enormous.
yes. Most of the people who signed the Declaration of Independence suffered financial loss. And yeah, great sacrifice. In fact, Jefferson, from his place in spirit, says that if he were in politics today, things would be very different. But not that he would have benefited unjustly from his position. He wouldn't have, I think.
Yeah, I would certainly hope, and I would certainly hope that he would have kept some of those same values,
Hmm.
even in today's times. I mean,
Right.
which I think it would be very difficult to do, I guess, right? I mean, we're all somewhat products of our times, and it seems like he was as well.
Yes, very much so. So I guess we're getting into talking about my latest book.
Yeah, yeah.
The first book that I wrote with Jefferson in mind was called Jefferson's Godfather. That's on Amazon, and it's a biography of his mentor, George Wythe. This new book is called The Metaphysical Thomas Jefferson. And for those who are viewing this, I'll show the cover. Whoops,
There
that
you go.
doesn't show up
Nice.
very well. Anyway, it's
I
kind of a
like the bust though.
metaphysical.
Yeah.
Yes, it's a bust of Jefferson. And it's called The Metaphysical Thomas Jefferson. And I had a medium channel him, and his observations were really fascinating, many quite unexpected by me.
So tell me a little bit about the genesis of the book, how you came to write it, how you found the medium that you were going to use to channel Jefferson, because it wasn't Jefferson specifically you were looking for, was it?
Not originally. uh,
Yeah.
It was a long process. Originally, I was looking for my late husband,
Yeah.
and that led to other things. But so I've always been interested in the afterlife, but I really became interested in it in 2013 when my husband died. And I would go outdoors and I would look at the stars and I would say, "Well, where are you? You know, I'm not hearing anything." And so I began reading about the afterlife. I began reading everything I could put my hands on by medical doctors, psychiatrists, PhD researchers, people with credibility. I did not go to religion. I already knew what religion said about the afterlife,
Mhm.
and I wanted another point of view. So I went on a reading journey then. And then I went to a writer's retreat. I was writing this first book about Jefferson and his mentor, which took about 5 years to write, by the way. And so I went to a writer's retreat, and there was a writer there who was an amateur medium. And she had written a book called Friends in High Places, which I thought was kind of cute because
Yeah.
she communes with spirits. So I said, "Well, Katie, do you channel people?" And she said, "Yes." And I said, "Well, do you think you can channel my husband?" This was 6 months after he had died. She said probably, and so I gave her his name and no other information. She went in her room, closed the door, came back a few minutes later, maybe a half hour later, with notes, and she described him perfectly.
Hmm.
And so one thing led to another, and then I went a few weeks later to a meeting of the Institute of Noetic Sciences, IONS. This is an organization founded by astronaut Edgar Mitchell. After he returned from the moon, he had a spiritual experience viewing the Earth from afar. And his goal in founding this organization was to bridge science with spirituality. So the speaker at that meeting was Irene Kendig. She had written a book of readings by a medium whose name is Jana Ana. And there were 7 readings, very compelling, with her mother and friends. And she published the book, and it won 4 national book awards and an international award. And I thought, well, the woman's got credibility, and maybe I'll call her. So I did. I made an appointment with her. And what we do is we agree on an hour. She calls it that precise time. At that time, I was using a yellow notepad for my notes. I used my laptop when I communicated with Jefferson. But so I asked her to access my husband, and I felt that he did come through. And later on, I talked to my parents. I talked to a friend who had died. I got some of my buddies in on it because I didn't want to be the Lone Ranger doing this crazy stuff. And so a friend came over, and we called up our late friend and felt that we had heard from her. And then my friend asked for some of her relatives who'd gone on, and she felt she had very, very strong feelings that she was hearing the real thing. So time went on, and somehow I got the idea that if I could communicate with normal people, with regular people, why not someone famous? Why not Thomas Jefferson? Because I'd already written about him, and I've always been interested in him. And I've always wanted to know the real person, behind the public facade. And so I asked the medium if she had channeled historic figures before. And she said she had, and she had done so for writers. And I don't know who they were. Maybe I could find, I guess I would, she probably wouldn't tell me. But anyway, she had done that for writers before. And so I didn't tell her in advance who I wanted to talk to, but we set a time. She called me right on the dot, as she always does. I put the phone on speaker. I had my laptop going. I had a number of questions to ask. Before I started the project, I thought it would be fun to ask some bona fide Jefferson historians, people who had written major books about the man, to participate in this, but they would be participating on the basis of it's a class project, because I had taught at the university level some Jefferson history. So I posed it as a class project. If you could talk with Thomas Jefferson today, what questions would you ask him? So 8 historians very kindly responded. Some didn't, some did, and provided a number of questions, some that I would have asked normally, but others that I wouldn't have thought of asking. And so I did ask all of their questions, as well as some that I had of my own. And so when Jana, the medium, called me, she said, well, what do you want to do today? And I said, well, I want to talk to Thomas Jefferson. And she didn't miss a beat, within a few moments, she said that he was there. I think they have a way on the other side of anticipating these things. I think they know when we are thinking about them. It's as if there's a green light that goes off, because everything on the other side is telepathic, and or at least what I've read. And I don't know any of this myself. It's just all what I've read.
Right. Well, I mean, a lot of this we can just kind of go on instinct, faith. I mean, there's a lot of things you can call it, I suppose, but right. I mean, there's no exact
Yes,
science to it. You just kind of have to feel your way through this process.
right. So at the beginning of the book, I tell readers, I said, there are only three ways of looking at this book. Uh, First way is I wrote it, I made it up. The second is the medium made it up. And the third is we are hearing from the other side, from somebody who is presenting himself as Thomas Jefferson. So I said, now I have 8 hours of recordings where it's proven that I'm the one who's asking the questions. I'm not answering the questions. The answers are coming from somewhere else. And so the second option is the medium is making all this up. And she majored in elementary education. She did not like history as a subject. She knew very little about Thomas Jefferson. So there's that point. And then there's the third point that we are hearing from Jefferson in spirit from the other side.
I did like how you addressed all those aspects of where somebody might possibly be coming from if they were to read the book. It definitely makes it feel more inclusive. It's not just
Right,
talking to one type of reader.
right. And also say that you will either accept this as a work of fiction or a work that has the ring of truth. And if you can only accept it as a work of fiction, then go ahead and read these observations about all of our institutions, our government, our universities, our foreign policy, the use of our military, our media, our religion, all of these things he talks about. And read those observations, and I think you'll find them very interesting, even if you think the medium or I made them up. They're still worth reading.
I agree. Were you skeptical in the beginning about this specific medium, if not the process?
Well, I think anybody who contacts a medium the first time is a little nervous about it. I was nervous when I asked for my husband. But after a while, but I had sessions once or twice a year with her for a number of years before I started the Jefferson Project. And I had every confidence that I was really talking with my friends and family on the other side. I mean, there were things that were coming through that she, 500 miles away from me, she lives in Indiana, I live in Virginia, however many miles that is. She doesn't know anything about my family, and the things that came through were very personal. So I began having a good bit of confidence in her. Also, mediums have gotten a bad reputation a century or two ago. They were thought to be callous individuals who preyed on gullible people. But in this century, things are changing a lot. You have mediums on TV, at least two or three, and a lot of people follow them. There are many books that are bestsellers on Amazon. But the part of that is of most interest to me is that there are very credible people at university settings who are now beginning to study the science of mediumship. And they're finding there are unusual brain waves in the brains of mediums. And also they do blind tests, clinical studies of the readings. And there is an astonishing accuracy in many of the readings. And these are being reported. That this individual by herself as just a normal human being without a gift would have no way of knowing some of the things that came through. So things are changing. I think we've been very much stuck in the material world for the last couple of hundred years and almost afraid, timid to study the metaphysical world, the spiritual world. But this is a new frontier in science today. Serious scientists are studying certainly the near-death experience. That is a major subject of research today.
There certainly seems to be a pendulum, doesn't there, where there was a
Mhm.
great deal of faith and spirituality, hundreds and thousands of years ago that tilted towards science. And I guess around Jefferson's time, or I kind of ironically, swinging all the way up through today, where I think you're right. I think a lot of people are beginning to explore more spiritual matters in a, I guess, a more serious way, for lack of a better word.
Yes. Um, so things are changing. I think people are a little more open-minded now.
Do you
I
think that
am
has
going
any?
out on a, excuse me, I just wanted to say I am going out on a limb with this book.
Yeah.
For some people, I think I'm nuts, but I felt that it needed to be done. And it's just like Dr. Weiss, Dr. Brian Weiss, with Many Lives, Many Masters,
Yeah.
put his reputation. He had a stellar reputation and stellar credentials, academic credentials, psychiatrist at Mount Sinai Hospital. He put his career online several decades ago with um, his discovery of reincarnation through his psychiatric practice.
I'm not really
And
familiar with him.
likewise,
I have to look
mhm,
this guy up.
yes, Many Lives, Many Masters is the breakthrough book in the Western world on reincarnation. It's giving it a scientific basis,
It's
or at least a
fantastic.
basis in psychiatry.
So, how did you overcome your fears about what others might think of you? Or was that ever heavy on your
Uh,
mind? It would be on mine, but maybe I'm a little more
well,
vain.
I'm retired. I could do whatever I want to do.
I love
So,
that. That's so great. I
no,
hope to make it that far.
no, I love to write, and I like to go where other people fear to tread. I've never been afraid of doing that, and so, my friends like me. They don't think I'm crazy. So
Good. I love it. I love the fearlessness of it. What kind of feedback have you gotten so far? I noticed a few really nice reviews.
I've gotten good reviews.
Yeah,
Um, well, I'm getting some speaking requests. People are curious about it.
great.
And so I think it's going well. When you look up Jefferson books on Amazon, there's some days, depending on the day, depending on how sales are going, it'll be right up there with some of the best sellers.
Hmm.
Um, the serious works of history about Thomas Jefferson. So I sometimes wonder what the serious historians are thinking about this book that seems to be trending up there. You
I
know, I'm,
wonder. I wonder.
well,
You know, what my last guest I had on, she's also a historian, and she kind of clued me in that historians can be a pretty contentious group of people. They can really kind
absolutely.
of snipe at each other.
Oh, yes. Yes. So I expect the book will be panned, but it hasn't really been reviewed. I think people don't know how to review it really, but
It's
but
hard to
it's up
categorize.
there.
Yeah.
Yes, it's hard to categorize. I in the beginning of the book, I say that that historians are steeped in physical history as well as they should be.
Hmm.
Uh, to be a genuine historian, you've got to stick with the letters and the documents and all the paper material that's available about the individual you're writing about. Um, and that should never change. And they can argue about the details of those things all day long with one another. But in the future, there may be a new course, and it may be called metaphysical history. And you would need a trusted medium if you were to do that, not just anybody, an experienced person. And I think there's a whole new world out there. I'm sure it could be flim-flammed if people wanted to
Oh,
do
sure.
that.
I think
But
any level of academia can't it?
right. But I asked Jefferson in the beginning. I said, I had this idea for a book. I said, do you think we have a book? And he said that he, in so many words, I'm paraphrasing right now, that he would participate with me because he thought my heart was in the right place. Um, in other words, I did not publish the book for money. I published it because I thought it needed to be published. And, it'd be nice if it were a big bestseller, but I honestly don't care about the money that much. I just need to get the word out. The same thing was true of my first book. I needed to get the word out about how the first generation of leaders of this country, well, I always look back fondly on the first leaders of the country as being a cut above what we have now, and they were. They had very high ethical principles. Not all of them, but many of them did. And I wanted to show that a lot of that went back to this great teacher that they had. Many of the leaders had, George Wythe, who modeled ethical statesmanship for the first leaders of this country. So those are the stories that I wanted to tell. And I wanted Jefferson to tell us what's wrong with this country right now, what's wrong with our government. And anyway, he was very negative about everything, as you saw from reading the book. And so finally I said, well, can't you say something positive? And I said, what if you were president? What if you were in Congress? And I felt that I needed to put him on the spot because I couldn't end the book negatively,
Right.
that you'll notice at the end of every chapter, there is a little note of hope about the future.
I did. Yes.
Yeah. And so he said that if he were to come back now, knowing what he knows as president at this moment, that he could do very little because there would be a lot of opposition to the reforms that he would want to make. So he would have to start in Congress, and he would have to form a small circle of integrity. And he would have to work with like-minded people who wanted the same reforms that he wanted. And then they would form a circle of integrity. And gradually they would try to add to that circle. And eventually they would be able to get the reforms that are needed to put our government back on track. He's very concerned about big money in campaigning. He says we need to get back to shaking hands the old-fashioned way, getting to know the people, that our elected representatives, many of them are not representing the people, they're representing big special money interests. We all know that, but his words have a special ring, I think. I thought they had great authenticity.
Did you get the impression that he thought that we totally screwed it up? I mean, because you said it's hopeful, so it's not irrevocable. Was there disappointment?
Well, there's concern. He said that there was even the beginning of corruption, even back in his day.
Mm-hmm.
Even during the revolution, there were people profiteering from our war. And so you've always had those kinds of people who will take advantage of a situation. And he said that free will, freedom, the freedom that they wanted for the people does allow for back doors, for people to enter through the back door and not be honorable. He said some of that had started in his day. And of course, when he died in 1826, partisanship had really reared its ugly head. And then later on in that century, our Congress is almost totally corrupt. It's not a new thing. And so it's been coming on gradually. But he said that some of the new people in Congress, he tries to whisper in their ears, try to remind them of their oaths of office. And that eventually it should right itself, that truth will out. He says the media, the freedom of the press was something that was extremely important to him and to the founding fathers.
Right.
But our media has been largely bought out by special interests. But he says the internet, the special interests tried to control the internet, but they found that they couldn't. And for better or for worse, there is some truth on the internet as well as a lot of falsehoods. And so that is the one outlet that he says will provide some truth here and there.
And I guess that would have been my question all along to some degree is, the more I don't, I started really studying the founding fathers this year, to be honest with you. I mean, I've always been a fan of history, but I haven't really read a lot about them until this year. And I wonder if this was true had I been reading about them in, say, the 1990s or the 1980s. I'm sure probably. But I do sense that there are so many parallels between their world and ours. And I think about things like, well, for example, like self-publishing a book, right? So many of our founding fathers self-published books, right? They wanted to get a story out there, they just self-published it and distributed
That's
it.
right.
The
Yeah.
the media at the time, very similar to the media landscape of today, as you just mentioned, it's almost Wild West in a sense, right? So that because of the internet, kind of similar to like pamphleteers of their times. And I also think about how, I was reading Ron Chernow's biography on George Washington, and I thought it was funny how like every kind of like major event in his life, and this was not the main point of the book, by the way, but this is just one tidbit I got from it. He went shopping, and like the equivalent of Amazon, right? He would order from the catalogs from Britain, right? So like when they made him the general of the Continental Army, the first thing he does is say, I need a bust of Caesar. I need to order a bust of Caesar from somewhere. And that's what he does.
Yeah.
Like, I think it's just great. I love that stuff. And
Yeah.
they didn't have Caesar, they had Shakespeare, and he was like, no, I'm a general now. It's a different mood, different flavor.
Yeah.
And I think that stuff is so interesting that I do believe, though, the more I talk about it, that I probably could see parallels no matter what time we're living in. Did you sense that in the conversations with him through the medium? Did you sense that he sensed that?
Well, he himself was a victim because of freedom of the press. He himself was a victim
Right.
of a lot of very vicious gossip, or you might say it had a ring of truth to it.
Sure.
But yet he was a very strong advocate for freedom of the press, even though it bit him from time to time.
Yeah.
He had to learn to not be so sensitive. I mean, you have to develop a hard skin if you're in politics.
Well, and every time I read about that, I think of Twitter, right?
Yeah.
All that stuff that happened to him and Hamilton and Burr. I just think it's the same as today on social media.
Right. Well, I have been encouraged in the last 30 years. We've had many, many more books on the founding fathers. There has been a renewed interest in that period as well. There should be. And
Yeah.
I think we forget that the freedoms that they fought so hard for our country and for the future generations were entirely unique in the world at the time. We take them for granted. Freedom of the press, freedom to criticize your leaders, freedom of religion was huge. And that was one of the three things that Jefferson wanted on his tombstone, one of his three lifetime accomplishments.
Right.
Number one, Declaration of Independence. Number two, America's first religious freedom law.
Mm-hmm.
And number three, the University of Virginia.
Right. Nothing about being the president. I love that.
No, nothing about that. Or ambassador to France or any of those things.
First Secretary of State. Not important.
That's right.
I love it.
That's right.
Yeah.
Because he thought these were, well, he was just being a public servant when he served in those offices. But what he did with those three accomplishments, he thought were universal, would last for generations.
Yeah. Yeah. So when you were meeting with Jana initially for the process of channeling Jefferson, I can't think of a good term for it, I guess, were you in person? Were you meeting face to face?
No, she lives in Indiana. I live in Virginia. So our process was we would agree a week ahead on an hour of time. She would call me at that precise moment.
Okay.
I would put my phone on speaker, got my laptop out. And so I would ask questions. And then when the answers started coming, I would type furiously away. And then I would get, I would say 3/4 of it at that time. But then the other quarter, I had to go back and listen many, many times to make sure that I was getting an accurate transcription.
Well, was it eerie at all, or?
Well, I never heard his voice. I never heard his voice. He did, and I have to explain this in the beginning of the book, he uses modern terminology, like words that were not popular in his day, not used in his day, like ego. He said that George Washington had PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder,
Mm-hmm.
or I guess in those days maybe they called it shell shock. I don't know, things like that. And now I did have Jana call up George Wythe, who spoke differently from Jefferson, and she said that he spoke in sort of quaint, very formal language. But I never heard, I just, the only thing I hear is what I hear from Jana. And she's trying to interpret as best she can. She's not translating as if she were translating Latin or something. If he uses a
Right.
modern word like ego, she'll say, he said, too much ego was involved, something like that.
Hmm. Did you get the sense that did you feel you were talking to him the whole time, or were there twinges of Jana as well?
I felt that I was, yeah.
Speaking to him the whole time.
Yeah, I think she's sincere. I don't think she makes stuff up. And she didn't remember any of it afterwards. And she didn't want me to send her the chapters before we finished because she thought maybe they might color her readings.
Makes sense.
Inadvertently. And so she was doing her best to bring him through. There were certain words that were a little beyond her that she would struggle with. And I would say, oh, yeah, I think he means to say such and such a word. And she said, yes, that's it. And also, she didn't know much about his personal life. She didn't know about the slave mistress that he was said to have, Sally Hemings.
Mm-hmm.
And so we had a conversation about Sally Hemings and his relationship with her. And the medium said that she was not familiar with that story, which had a very interesting twist to it, by the way.
In the conversations with the medium?
In the chapter that in
right.
the book on slavery, she comes through in that chapter.
Sally,
yeah.
Yes. Do you think there was any regret on his part? Did you sense that much? Yeah.
Oh, yes, he has regrets.
I meant about Sally specifically. Or was it a genuine love and affection?
Well, everyone who's familiar with the story speculates, did he force himself on her? Was it a loving relationship? And of course, no one knows. The only thing we have heard about her was that she was very beautiful. And I do want to come to Jefferson's defense on one thing. Some people assume that he cheated on his wife, with slave woman, as many men did. But his wife died young, and she made him promise on her deathbed that he would not remarry because she had stepmothers, and she did not want a stepmother brought in over their children.
Right.
So he made a solemn promise never to remarry, never did. But he was still young, only I think about 39 when she died. And so he was a normal man with normal instincts.
Well, also, and plus people forget that she was his wife's half sister, really, right?
Yes. She was, they had the same father, and she also had a white grandfather. So she was 3/4 white. And they said she was very beautiful, that she had long straight hair down to her waist and was really quite beautiful, according to some descriptions. And so, so anyway, but still no one really knew whether it was a good relationship or a forced relationship. So what came through in the readings is that, yes, he does still have a very high respect for Sally, that Sally is far greater than one lifetime, that lifetime at Monticello, and that he does interact with her in their spirit form. He was pretty cagey about the physical relationship. He didn't really want to go. He didn't want to go there.
Right.
And he said, "Oh, well, I have," these are my words, but basically he said, I've run that scene through my mind so many times, I really don't want to hash it over again.
Who's he spending more time with, her or Martha?
Oh, well, that's a good question. I think everybody's happy on the other side. There's no jealousy on the other side.
No?
Everybody likes one another on the other side.
That was, I
It's
really
one
hope
thing I've
so.
learned.
Yeah.
Or they at least try to understand one another on the other side. But so anyway, he said that yes, he had a very high regard for her during that lifetime in private, but he could never show it publicly for fear that what he wanted to accomplish in the country on a national basis, for fear that would be jeopardized, that it
Right.
was a leap too far for him to make at that time. And he said he's not excusing himself, but he was a product of his generation, that he was clearly taught about the superiority of certain races and the inferiority of others. And that was how everyone was conditioned from birth.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, since then, he said, if he were to come back today, obviously his sensibilities would be completely different. But you have to understand that he was a man.
Mm-hmm.
He wasn't a saint, and he was a product of his environment. But he tried to be a kindly master. And I think he did have a great love and respect for Sally in private. She resented that he never would acknowledge her publicly.
Jeez, I can only imagine.
Mhm.
Yeah. What was the editing process like? What did you decide? How did you decide what to keep and what not to?
I kept just about everything. I did take one founding father. Well, I'm not sure he's a founding father, but one major figure from that period out of the book, because somehow I don't know what happened with that one, but that was Aaron Burr. And he was a lot friendlier. The things that he was saying about Aaron Burr were so much friendlier from the spirit level than they were when they were alive.
Really?
And of course, again, when you cross over, you lose a lot of your animosities. That
Yeah.
the other side is filled with love. So I've read.
That's so interesting because I think that's one of my favorite parts of that history that is not written about enough is their relationship
Yeah.
specifically, because I know there was always tension between the two of them, right? Or was there always, or at one point did they get along?
I think there may have been times when they got along. And to tell you the truth, I'm not as familiar with his story as I am with some of the other founding fathers.
Me neither.
But
Yeah.
somehow I just thought the historians would have a real problem with that. And I wanted the historians at least to have a willing suspension of disbelief, and also I wanted the book to be accepted by liberals as well as conservatives. I tried to be very careful about presenting issues, that the problems that we have today have been a long time in coming. You can't blame this administration or the last administration entirely on the corruption in government and some of the issues that we're seeing.
Right. Right. Exactly. Is there anything that you wish you would have asked them that you didn't get a chance to?
I can't think of any more questions. I tried to cover the most important issues. I am grateful for the questions that I would not have thought of myself. One of them came from an historian, and he said, to ask this, he said to Jefferson, who was the greatest influence in your life? And I would have said George Wythe, because that's my point of view.
Mm-hmm.
But Jefferson's answer was, other than my mother. And that really surprised me, because I had been led to believe, just from what I've read about his childhood, that possibly he and his mother were not close, because he wrote prodigiously. He wrote thousands of letters, and he wrote very little, nothing, hardly anything about his mother. And so from that, some historians have assumed that they had a cool relationship, a poor relationship. But he said that his mother did have her troubles, that if she were alive today, she would be treated with medication and counseling. So apparently she had some mental problems. I don't know, some maybe chemical imbalances, whatever. But that she gave him a great gift as a child. And and of course he must have been a very precocious child because he was a genius. So I don't know how chatty he was, but sometimes when you have chatty children, you don't listen to them all the time. But he said that whenever he had something to say, she dropped everything that she was doing and she locked eyes with him and she listened to him very intently. And he said, you just have no idea how important that is to a child to be listened to. That was a surprising revelation. I did not anticipate that answer.
Wow. A lot has been discussed about the founding fathers' faith, his specifically, whether or not he was a believer, a deist, an atheist, etc. Any insight into how he felt then versus now?
Yes, he was always a critic of organized religion. And when he was in France as the ambassador to France, he got to see firsthand how corrupt religion had become in Europe. And not as it wasn't as awful as it was during the Italian Renaissance, but still pretty bad at that time in the 18th century, with the collusion between popes and kings and priests and the common man's interest being kind of secondary to power and money and greed. And of course, that wasn't true of all churches. There were and still are good churches who do carry on the faith, the good faith. But a lot of people have taken advantage of the church hierarchy for power and gain. That's not a new revelation, but he didn't want that to come to America. He didn't want America to, well, as they say, absolute power corrupts absolutely. So he wanted people to have freedom of choice regarding their religion. So he wrote, I have to credit George Wythe for part of this. They worked as a team to revise Virginia's legal code after we declared our independence. And one of the 125 laws that they revised and came up with new statutes to present to the Virginia legislature in 1779. One of those laws was a statute for religious freedom. But that was the product of a team, not one individual. Wythe and Jefferson were the remaining members of a 5-man committee tasked with revising the legal code. Anyway, Jefferson wrote the final version of that bill in beautiful, beautiful language. It's ageless. It's wonderful. And so he has a right to claim that on his tombstone. But I don't think the idea was original to him. I think, there were others who had thought of that before. But he did write the statute. Anyway, religious freedom was extremely important to Jefferson. And but he was always a critic of organized religion. And so he said that, so I asked him about it, and he said that that the Christ energy, I think a lot of people are calling it that today, is alive, is real, that the name of Jesus has power if called upon, but that Jesus has withdrawn his energy from many churches now because they are about judgment and not about kindness and love. Some of them are about money and power and judgment. And that's not what Jesus would have wanted. And so he said Jesus is withdrawn from those institutions, no longer there. that wasn't a blanket criticism. We all know faith groups that are loving and kind and um, generous to the poor and have all the good virtues that we would want. But that as an institution, the church has gone astray in many respects, gone away from the basic, simple teachings of Jesus. So I asked him if he was pleased with what's called the Jefferson Bible. During the last years of his life, he took several versions, ancient and modern, of the Bible, including the King James, and he basically did a cut and paste job. And he took out miracles and things that he thought would detract from the basic teachings of Christ and the basic life of Jesus. So he did his own version of the Bible, of the Gospels, the four Gospels. And it's called the Jefferson Bible, although that's not the title of it. The title of it is something like the life and morals of, or the life and teachings of Jesus of Nazareth.
Mm-hmm.
And for a long time, that book was given to new members of Congress. It hasn't been recently, but Jefferson also had a Quran, the Muslim
Mm-hmm.
book of faith. And he was studying Muslim law under George Wythe at the time. And so that book, Jefferson's original beautiful leather-bound copy of the Quran, has been used by at least two congressmen, one woman, one man, I think, in the swearing-in ceremony in Congress. And I think Jefferson would have been interested in that. But,
Very much so. I think so
yeah.
too.
Mm-hmm.
That surprises me.
Yeah.
So did you, he spoke in modern vernacular, but did he give any indication that he was displeased with how our language has changed from his days?
No, that didn't come up. No.
I was just curious
Mhm.
because I think every generation worries a little bit about what we'll lose about our language. And I wonder if his was any exception.
Well, I think, and these are my words, not his. He says that our colleges have been dumbed down.
That's an understatement.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he has some criticism for institutions of higher learning that it's more about the institution now than it is about the students very often. Keeping the institution going with funding, the continual need for outside funding is creating compromises that he would rather not see. And he criticizes what's laughably called student athletics today.
How so? In what way did he criticize it?
Well, basically, all that's changed. Originally, students who had athletic abilities were also students. You know, it was just part of their academic life and not a profession, not designed to create celebrities who would go on to make big money in professional sports. And he called college sports cash cows. That's a modern term that he used.
Well, I like how, you kind of ended things with a call to action. What did you personally take from that? What do you think you're going to do differently after this experience?
Well, same thing I've been doing. I'm giving talks. I give classes at the university level, at university affiliates, continuing education affiliates. And I give a lot of talks to groups. My talk that I give most is called America's First Leadership Crisis, 1776, when we had no leaders trained to govern in a democratic republic because there wasn't one till the Constitution was passed some years later. And so I end my talk encouraging people. I'm kind of a cheerleader for people to get involved in government. And because so many of the people I know they vote in November, but they don't really participate in any other way.
Mm-hmm.
They might show up at a June primary, or they might forget about it.
Mm-hmm.
And most of the people I know do not go to precinct meetings either for the Republican Party or the Democratic Party, and that's where it all happens. And so I encourage every group that I speak to, that democracy is not a spectator sport. We need to get involved. We need to be better informed. And they say we get the government we deserve. And if we have
Mm-hmm.
a less than stellar government right now, we only need to look at ourselves. And
Yeah, and vice versa too, right? I mean, they're a reflection of us just as much as we are of them. I mean, by that I mean every time, because I agree with you, we need to be more involved, but I always find myself coming back to the fact that, who has time? Who has time for this stuff? I mean, everybody's demanding our attention all the time. Um, forgetting just the entertainment sector of society, but just work, family, things like that. Like, how does one really get involved?
that's a really good question. Well, the first thing you do is that we all need to do is keep informed.
Yeah.
And one thing Jefferson said in the book is that the thing that he misses most on this planet is critical thinking.
Mm.
And he didn't say, if you see it on Facebook, he didn't say Facebook, but he said people will accept things that they are seeing, reading, hearing at face value. They do not run it through their brain, and they just swallow whatever they're hearing without critical thinking. And he is calling for us to become more critical, better critical thinkers. And I think this goes back to the educational system. I think we're not schooled in that. And so that would be the first thing, would be to be informed. I'm very sad that a lot of people are not reading the newspapers, whether online or in print, the way we used to. The newspapers are shrinking, and they're not providing as much news as they used to, just covering local politics. There's less of that going on, and that's absolutely essential for people to know what's going on in
Right.
their city and in their state. Most people don't care, until something blows up. But
True.
so number one is to be informed, and then number two is to make activism a priority. We should all be writing checks to good candidates. We should all be voting against the bad candidates.
Right.
And
right. It's just a shame that there are so few of those good ones.
That's right. I happen to have a good congresswoman. I happen to think she's one of the good ones. So
which one do you have?
Her name is Abigail Spanberger.
Okay,
and
I don't know much about her.
I send checks to her, regardless of her party. She is bipartisan, and she works for the people, in my opinion. So I support her.
Just like the founding fathers did. They had to work together.
And when I'm voting, I always vote for the lesser of two evils. I will never vote the party line.
I don't either. Jefferson, he hated parties, didn't he? And yet, ironically, became the head of one.
Yes. Well, he had very strong feelings about states' rights versus federalism,
Right.
because he felt with the states having more independence that the people would be better protected that way.
Yeah.
They would have greater freedom that way. And he addresses that in the book, that states' rights are not what they used to be, that the states really have become an extension of the federal government now. And the same infection has come into the limbs of the body, as he said, because the states have become more and more dependent on the federal government, and he wanted them to be more independent.
Do you think that you and Jana are going to partner up again and continue with the project? Well,
somebody said, well, why don't you write a book or produce a book about Abraham Lincoln? And I said, well, I'm really interested in the colonial period. I know things about Lincoln, I admire him and so on, but I'm not compelled to write about him. Yeah. But I am, for some reason, I've been really, really interested in a colonial figure that nobody's ever heard of, but I have wanted to tell her story for a number of years. And I had the title to the book, but I didn't have anything to go on except her birth and death and her children's births and deaths, and date of her marriage and all that, and the epitaph that was on her tombstone. But the title of the book that I have, and I'm still going to use it, I think I will produce the book, is The Richest Woman in America. And this woman was married to the man who was arguably the richest man in America when he died in 1730s. His name was Robert King Carter. And I thought, well, what would it have been like to have been married to somebody that wealthy back in the day, to be a slave mistress, to have all those children, to lose your children in their early years to diphtheria or whatever was going on then, childbirth. And so, but the only way that I can find out about her is through metaphysical means now.
Because there's just no information really.
No, she left no diaries. I doubt that she even wrote diaries. And well, she was born in the 17th century, so I don't even know how educated she was. But
yeah.
I, for some reason, feel that her story needs telling, and I think that I will tell her story for her.
Do you worry at all that you might hear something you don't want to? And how do you think you would handle that?
I did access her one time, and I found that she did not have a happy life, and well, no, I mean, there's nothing that concerns me personally. You know, I'm fairly objective about it, but I do think she has a fascinating story, and according to what the medium said, she has reincarnated today, and she had a mental problem, according to what came through in the reading, brought on by probably lead poisoning. And so the medium said that she is alive today, reincarnated, and that she is a mental health professional working on that very same problem.
So interesting.
Yeah.
Well, Suzanne, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate you talking to me today.
I enjoyed it too.
Amazing things, yeah.